go now. And so thank you so much for joining us today for our introduction to Living Shorelines webinar, which is webinar number 1 of a series that the Ecology Action Center's coastal team is going to be putting on about coastal adaptation options. I've spent 2 years in this work complaining that there aren't a lot of accessible, user-friendly options available to Nova Scotians and other coastal property owners and municipal decision makers about what are the options for adapting to coastal climate change. So I decided it was time to do something about it, and so here we go. So first of all, I'd like to say again, thank you for joining us. I'm Nancy Anningston. I'm the Coastal Adaptation Senior Coordinator with the Ecology Action Center's coastal team. I'm joined today by our wonderful presenter, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, Rosemary Lonas. I'm also having all kinds of help behind the scenes from 2 fabulous employees at the Ecology Action Center, Hope and Rowan. They are behind the scenes working things on Facebook and Zoom and helping me manage the technology side of this. So I'm very, very grateful for them. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. We are gathering virtually today on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory, which is governed by peace and friendship treaties. As we're discussing our shared environment and learning about climate change, and as the EAC is doing our work in environmental justice, it's really important for us to remember our relationship to the land and to have the opportunity to follow the leadership of the Mi'kmaq people and to learn from them as the original stewards and knowledge holders of our environment and this land where we live. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement. And without further ado, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of what we're going to do today. We are starting a little late, and I do apologize. I'm about to introduce our host for today's presentation. And so I'll do that introduction, and then we'll have a chance to say hello to Rosemary. And then we're going to turn over to a pre-recorded segment, Rosemary's presentation, which is approximately 28 minutes. As soon as that's done, we're going to reconvene here throughout the presentation. If you're joining us with Zoom, I would encourage you to please put your questions and comments in the questions and answer feature on Zoom. And on Facebook, I believe you're able to do something similar. What we will do is manage and collect all of those questions and address them and organize them so that when we come back after the presentation, Rosemary can answer your questions. We may have a lot of questions, so we may have limited time, but if we do, what we'll do is perhaps find a way for you to follow up with a longer question, and we'll try to organize them. And if we have 2 similar questions, we'll blend those together and so on. So we're hoping to manage those, get the conversation started here. And as I say, this is webinar 1 of a series of webinars, so lots more to come. So I want to introduce Rosemary Lonas. Rosemary is the founder of Helping Nature Heal, an organization based out of Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, that was founded in 2001. Rosemary has her BA in Conservation and Environmental Studies from York University, but she's also studied a myriad of other very relevant topics. So organic gardening, architectural design, landscape management, shoreline erosion, the list goes on and on. That's all I could fit in my notes, but she's our resident expert in Nova Scotia on living shorelines. Rosemary had been doing her work for some time and was finding a prevailing theme that her clients who lived along the coast were experiencing accelerated coastal erosion. And so Rosemary took it under her responsibilities to learn more about what could be done to help slow accelerated erosion. I mean, erosion's a natural practice, but Rosemary was trying to help her clients when they were dealing with really dramatic accelerated erosion. So she consulted with all kinds of different experts from the United States, across Canada, here at home. Some examples are Kevin Smith from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Robert Taylor, who's an expert here in Nova Scotia, and many other experts. And she set about learning everything she could about what could be done in a restoration and ecological and green way of addressing accelerated erosion. Rosemary has a greenhouse herself that grows thousands of plants every year, and they are native plants to our environment, plants with really strong solid root systems that can intertwine and help hold things in place, such as alders, raspberries, certain roses, fir. Rosemary consults broadly and shares her knowledge. I got to hear her for the first time at a licensed planner's presentation in June of 2018, and I learned a ton and know that I've only scratched the surface. Rosemary consults with Park Canada, offers her advice to government as they consider coastal climate change, and does all sorts of sharing of the knowledge as she goes. And Rosemary's work takes place in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and across the province of Nova Scotia. Everywhere there's a coastline, you will find her team of experts hands-on doing this important work. And Rosemary is also forming Shore Up Nova Scotia, a really important program to share knowledge with coastal communities so that they can learn more about living shorelines practices. And so we're really excited to see where she goes with that. She's a sustainability ally helping nature heal of the Ecology Action Center, and we are delighted to have her here today. So thank you so much, Rosemary.
Thank you for having me, Nancy. It's wonderful to be here.
Awesome. So what we're going to do now, I think, is you and I are going to turn our cameras off, and we're going to turn it over to the experts to let the presentation start.
So welcome to our Living Shoreline presentation. This is a brief discussion on how using natural and plant-based systems can be beneficial in managing coastal erosion on your property. So first we'll go into some typical questions some data that people don't know all the time about our province. Nova Scotia has approximately 13,000 kilometers of shoreline, which is one of the highest numbers in all of the maritime provinces. And most of the people in Nova Scotia live in coastal communities, up to 86%. And that is really striking and very important to note because of future information that we have coming down the pipeline. So most of the people live in these coastal communities, and that Nova Scotia, out of all of the maritime and Atlantic provinces, will see the most experience around climate change. And the current data says that that's between 2 and 4 feet of sea level rise within this century. So that's a lot. If you can imagine standing on your property now and thinking about an additional 2 feet of water on your property, even as much as 4 feet of water, I'm only 5'5", so that's, up to my neck. And if I lived in a coastal plain, I would be very concerned about that, having all that additional water in our system. And a quick note about the upcoming Coastal Protection Act. Although that piece of legislation is still at the government and still making its way through the process, at this stage, they say that all current landowners will be grandfathered in so that they won't have to worry about new setbacks and having to potentially move their homes backwards or rebuilding infrastructure on their property. So they won't have to be asked to maybe move their septic field to the other side of the house if their current septic is between the water and their home. So that is great if you're a current landowner and you own property, that you'll have that bit of protection against the new regulations. But what it actually means is that your land and your development may not be protected under the new regulations, and therefore you won't have access to new information about that. I'm not sure that I'm really saying that correctly. Since 86% of our population, 86% of the shoreline is privately owned, 70% of the population is already there. It means that 70% of those people are likely not to be highly affected by the Coastal Protection Act, which means that on the one hand, they won't have to worry about new setbacks and regulations coming in. But the downfall, on the other hand, is that they won't be protected by those regulations either. So there's a juxtaposition that's going to be happening here where only new development, new homeowners, new ownership of the land along the coast will actually benefit from this new Coastal Protection Act. That is a bother to me because most of the people are living there and are already living there. And so what do we do with these folks that don't get the benefits of, you know, starting fresh with the correct buffer systems and the correct setbacks? This is where Helping Nature Heal comes in a lot into, you know, helping those people to strategize around coastal erosion and what they're going to do about it. So we'll hit the next slide here and see pretty devastating reality is that we are losing a lot of material off the coast. This is a low bank, which is being undercut by shoreline erosion, and definitely by sea level rise. This will greatly impact what's happening here on the shore. So I belong to some really great organizations, the Atlantic Association of Landscape Designers, the Ecology Action Center, of course. We're a sustainability ally for those, for that NGO, a member of the Construction Safety Association and Landscape Nova Scotia. We've won several awards through the Reader's Choice program, nominated twice by the Canadian Museum of Natural History and Nature for sustainability projects that we've been doing and community organizing community events. And of course, the big one, Centerfront, is the Coastal Zone Canada Award, which we won in 2014 for our significant and continuing work on coastal erosion management and educating people about that. So we've, you know, we've touched base with a number of the organizations that help to move this ideology of plant-based systems forward. And we're working really strategically to help educate people around coastal erosion and some of the benefits that they can do themselves, some of the options that are available for construction from contractors as well. So here's a schematic that we did for a project quite a number of years ago. And it's really one that makes a large impact, I think. So here we see maybe a typical kind of landscape where there's a few trees, maybe there's some plants in a buffer zone, a small buffer zone at the frontage. And we see that there's usually a lot of mowing. People want to clear the front line of their coastal property so that they get that $1 million view. That's why, you know, so many people love Nova Scotia and move here, is to have this great benefit of our beautiful coastline. And oftentimes when people purchase land, the first thing they do is clear cut the property so that they can make room for building the house, putting in a septic, having the well constructed, all of that infrastructure that's really valuable and important to us on our home. But we don't realize that by taking away that vegetation, we're really impacting how the water lands on our property and what happens to it as it moves downhill to the ocean. If we remember, water always takes the easiest route and it always moves downhill, except if you're at Magnetic Hill, perhaps in New Brunswick. But there's certain sort of rules and laws that water, that are held around water. And by taking away the plants, by mowing heavily, by putting a lot of hard landscaping or hard infrastructure like our homes and driveways onto coastal properties, it actually significantly impacts the erosion rates and the ability for the land to absorb the water and to become more of a sponge instead of a deflector of energy. So we'll have a look at what happens when it's fully planted. So here's the same schematic with more plants added to it. So you can see that as the rain falls from the sky, when there's more plants, the water bounces off the plants transfers energy from the rain droplets, from the velocity coming down out of the sky into the plants themselves. We know this happens simply from watching the plants. We see the leaves move and the branches are swaying in the breeze. That's energy transport from the mechanism into the plant itself. As this water is bouncing off the plants and then hitting lower plants in the ecosystem, the energy again is lessened and transferred into the plant itself until eventually the water is dripping onto the ground, and that surface can easily absorb gentle rain or gentle droplets that are bouncing through that structure. So the vegetation the above ground vegetation is actually really protecting us like a vegetation quilt over top of the soil horizon. This really helps to protect the land from erosion from droplet to droplet, but also having the soil well vegetated and covered relieves the soil system from dehydration, from losing minerals through that evaporation process, and it really keeps the surface of the soil malleable and spongy and absorbent. What else happens when we have lots of diversity in the ecosystem, trees and shrubs and perennials and ground covers, grasses and ferns and mosses, is that there's a lot of critters actually living in that space now because there's so much diversity. There's food, there's places for shelter, space to raise their young. So the animals really want to live in this ecosystem that is more whole rather than isolated. So when we reduce the mowing and we add these diversity of plant species to the shoreline, we invite the critters in. And the critters are so important, not only because they're using up the space, but they're eating the seeds and the nuts and the berries that these plants produce, and they start to poop them out. And that's a really exciting thing that gets happening. We call that the poop loop. And so these birds eat the seeds, they digest them and churn them up, and then they poop them on the ground. Now that seed has the opportunity to actually germinate. It comes with its own little package of compost, the poop, and that poop then is also eaten by the soil food web critters, all the critters that are living inside the healthy soil horizon. When the soil isn't healthy, those critters move on, they go somewhere else. So when it's hard and compacted and not planted in, there's very little life within the soil horizon. When we have a full ecosystem with all of the parts connected, then there's critters living in there like those birds, but there's also the nematodes and the fungi and the bacteria and all those microscopic little critters that really make our ecosystem whole and complete and much stronger. The microbiology is really the magic. When those little bacterias and fungi are eating up the detritus of the leaf litter, the coarse woody debris, they're decomposers. They're taking bits and pieces of that material and they're pulling it down deep into the soil. And there it can continue to decompose or be fed to other critters. And so we have this loop of nutrients that keep cycling around a healthy ecosystem. And when we have a healthy soil system, it means that the roots of those big trees can dive even deeper down into the coastal soils and bind more soil together. They can also attach to all the other root systems that are available, the alders and the bayberry and the wild roses. All of those root systems migrate and form this underground netting that really binds and holds the soil together. And this is a real magical moment. This is where the nature is actually doing the work for us. So the goal is to revegetate these coastal systems so that the plants and all of that energy can be working towards a good goal for us rather than being sloughed off by the storms and the waves and the action that happens. So we want to encourage people to plant more plants, Be more particular about how you clear developing properties. Think about pruning instead of cutting down trees. Think about adding missing species within the ecosystem. Doing less mowing, therefore, which definitely reduces compaction of the soil, which also prevents overland flow. When the soil is really hard and compacted and the rain comes down, it flows more and more quickly towards the sea. It takes sediment with it. It takes bits and pieces of debris and nature along that journey with it and puts it back into the ocean. There's also this very interesting phenomena, which many of you have already experienced. And I like to think of it as the spilt milk phenomena. When you spill milk on your kitchen table, it doesn't just run to the edge of the table and drip straight down onto the floor, giving you a big puddle. It actually has this cellular magnetism. It goes over the edge of your table and it somehow goes underneath the table a little. And the drip is actually way over here, right? You've probably all seen that. There's a cellular magnetic that helps to hold it in there, the surface energy that keeps it held to that tabletop. And so it's that dripping that often causes a lot of erosion right at the crest of the coastline. And that spongy layer of root systems holds as much water as possible. Once it meets its carrying capacity, it starts to drip and it actually creates its own erosion all by itself. And it wears away at the soils along the slope of the bank. And that's where more erosion happens. And as we watch more and more development happen along the coastline, we see that overland flow is really a big part of our coastal erosion problem. And so we can do something about that by slowing that water down as it travels through our landscape. And we can also plant heavily along the edges so that the plants take up more of the water and distract that water from slipping right over the edge like the tail top and dripping away and causing more challenge. So this is a really important ideology that we want to convince everyone about and encourage people to do more planting on the coastal for sure. All right. So what is a living shoreline anyway? I thought the best way to explain that would be by showing you one. So this is a property in Prince Edward Island, and you can see in the center of this photo, there's some new plants and new infrastructure here. To the left of the photo, we can see where nature has done the work herself. There's lots of shrubberies and grasses and perennials growing there. And in the center is a space of work that we've done. So in the center of this photograph is work that we've completed already, and it's holding up pretty good. So what we've done here is stake hay bales in place. These are to absorb and reflect some of the water energy that is flowing through this location. And to the left of this photo, you can see where there's open soil, and so actively eroding still. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see that there's some little spots of vegetation growing on that slope. And that tells us that the sediment is slowing down. It's softening up enough that seeds can actually germinate in it. And so that's a good sign. So this is sort of our first investigation to think that, can this system of plant-based strategy work? And so what we've done here, to just give you a little bit of information on how we've used the plants in this space, we've created a brush wall at the top, and we've lined the base of the crest with hay, and we've also put some sod blankets on there. So as the overland flow comes to the edge of the coastline, those materials, that coarse woody debris, the hay and the grass, will help to absorb and slow down that dripping that we just talked about. Further down the slope, about halfway, we've put another layer of hay bales, and some more sod blankets strategically laid out so that we can capture runoff. If you look really closely, you can see there's a white tube coming down that slope, and that's the homeowner's drains from their weeping tile around their basement. A lot of developers are still putting that weeping tile out to sea, and that's causing a lot of problems when we have this concentrated flow of water being pushed by the sump pump and going down onto the shoreline. It really does erode quite quickly. So we are encouraging new homeowners to put that drainage pipe on the other side of the property and drain it perhaps into a ditch or an upland marsh, or use it in a garden, or build a rain garden around it so that it can be absorbent, and rather than causing trouble, it can actually be a feature for our property. In this particular instance with this photo, it's definitely causing damage. And if you look below that white pipe, you can see that it's quite valleyed, and that water has been, spewing there for years and years, slowly eroding the sediment down the slope. So right at the base of this slope here, you can see that we have another pile of hay that's absorbing and trying to carry that water. There's another brush wall. And then in the second version of this project, we would have planted native species, and we would have mimicked those that we've seen nature doing all on her own. So bayberries and alders and roses and grasses and all those coastal shrubberies, perennials, and grasses. So this is kind of a quick overview of what it looks like on this kind of a landscape. Of course, it looks different on different regions, and we'll look through a couple of those in the coming slides. So the living shoreline is the strategic use of living and decomposing biomass. By biomass, we need plant-based vegetation. The reason we need to have this decomposition, what we call strategic composting of materials on the coastline, number one, it feeds the soil ecosystem, so that soil food web critters come up and they pull that material down into the soil. Some of it gets left behind, some of it gets pooped out, right? So it's a food source for the plants that we're installing and for the existing plants that already live there. The covering of the soil actually creates this knitted or woven blanket on top of the open soil. And that really helps to shade the soil horizon, especially when it's on a cliff. It shades the soil from the freeze-thaw cycles, especially through the winter and early spring. In Nova Scotia, the sun is quite low in the horizon in the winter time. And on a warm day without snow cover, which happens a lot on coastal properties, that sun is beaming down and hitting the slope of that shoreline really full on and really warming it up to the point that we can have several freeze-thaw cycles in a day. When we have freezing and thawing of our soils, it breaks and fractures them where there aren't roots holding it together, knitting it together. And so big chunks can actually fall right off your shoreline. Big boulders that are locked in the soil horizon can then pop right out of that shoreline. And we can see a lot of water melting and ice melting throughout the soil horizon and causing movement of sediment as well. So whether it's fine, dusty sediments or big chunks or whole segments, this knitted covering protects it. It's a blanket. It allows it to stay frozen all winter long and to then slowly thaw over time rather than going through this rapid movement, this rapid freeze thaw. We tend to use all of nature's own materials, right? We don't want to contribute to plastics in the ocean or garbage escaping the system and getting out into the world. So we like to use things like logs and brush and hay, and of course, all the appropriate plants that should or already are living in that ecosystem. And we want to make sure that everything that is in there is natural and that could decompose over time with the right contribution of water and sunshine and whatnot. Once these shorelines are established, they tend to mitigate erosion because of the mechanisms that they've been put together with. So that blanket helps to prevent the driving rains from beating up against that coastline and sloughing off large chunks of soil. We just talked about the freeze-thaw effect through the winter and spring. And they also help to what we call sort of self-serving or self-strengthen. Because they're plants and they're living, breathing entities, just like you and I, they have offspring just like us too. So they might be producing a flower that produces a berry and a seed later on, or they might be of a certain root type that sends little baby rootlings off to the edges like that. So they recreate themselves when they're living in a happy ecosystem. So over time, they keep growing, right? The first day of a living shoreline is probably the worst day because it's new and there's only a certain amount of plants there. Over time, they generate themselves, they generate their offspring. So there's more and more plants later. And this is why we often think of a coastline as an ecosystem, as a living entity of itself, so that we can keep nurturing and growing that coastline over time with more plants and more connection. All right. So this is a technique that we've been using a fair amount, especially on these low bank coastlines. This is a location up in the Caribou River on the Northumberland Strait, and this is where we did a wattling technique. So you can see all the vertical posts along the coastline there. What we've done is gone into this forest, and trees that were less than 10% alive with just a little bit green on them were coming down. There were some storm damaged trees as well that had already fallen down. And so we've taken the sort of the skeleton, these hard wood, and woven it through these vertical posts to create sort of a wattle fence. A wattling is sort of an old English technique where they make, they used to make sort of sheep fences and things out of miscellaneous debris wood. So there's a vertical component, the posts, and then there's the wattling that gets woven through the posts. So we often use the harder, more heavy wood for the wattling, and then we brush wall into it. So you can see the greenery has been woven in and through this skeleton that is weaving its way along this coastline. We've also then planted in front and behind it with ocean grasses. So these are Spartina and Marum grasses specifically on the beach side. And then on the forest side, we've added things like alders and small trees, evergreen and hardwood, as well as a variety of shrubs. And so these plants together, when their roots really engage with the soil and with each other, are really going to help to protect this coastline from further erosion later on. All right, yeah. Okay, so here's some other strategies that we've used in the past. On the top right, we see a coastal property, and we've done a hay blanket cover. There's seaweed on there. We've also done a bit of weaving. The two insets in this also show the weaving technique. That's of alder branches. On the top right-hand side, we see toe protection with boulders and rocks. And amongst those, we have hay bales. And behind them, we have spruce, white and black spruce, and willow. And those are strategically placed there so that their upper part of their bodies, their above ground vegetation, can buffer the action of the wind and the rain and the waves, but also protect the soil behind from that undenying wind that's just blowing really hard onto the coast. On the bottom right-hand side, we see a brush wall between pine trees. This is also at the crest of a property overlooking the ocean. And on the bottom left, we see strategic composting on a large slope that already has lots of trees, but was missing the understory. So we started by strategizing, planting brush walls throughout the slope, making our way all the way up to the crest, and then using the spaces between those brush walls to actually plant trees and shrubs and perennials. And they gain a little protection from the brush wall from the winds. And they also provide all of that safety coming from the material coming down. So the water coming down over that slope now has all these different speed bumps that it has to go through in order to hit the ocean. So it's very less likely that it's going to cause any damage because it's losing its velocity as it goes down the slope. All right. So we call this the from the land to the water approach. We like to work from the homeowner's perspective, from the, the dry side all the way down to the water side. So that whole slope then becomes our canvas for which we work. So we want to slow down compaction and therefore overland flow. We want to slow down or eliminate sediment movement that would have been taken by that water as runoff. We want to stabilize the embankment itself so that those root systems knit together and bind the soil as well as bind to themselves. And we want to grow those plants on that slope so that it stabilizes, so it doesn't just chunk off when the wind and the rain get to it. We want to add biodiversity so that we invite the critters to live here again, so we get that poop loop happening. But we also want to try to mimic the natural processes of what would have been there prior to development or prior to a storm event that reduced the plant vegetation on that slope. So having the right plants in the right place makes a big difference. And we want it to be structurally dense. So we want to plant it really thickly so that the rain that's falling from the sky, the wind that's blowing in, and the waves that might bounce up on there have lots of infrastructure that they can lose some of their energy by bumping into plants and branches and blades of grass and shrubberies and things. So the idea is that this planted or vegetated slope now has many different mechanisms to help lessen the impact of the coastal change, the climate change that's happening, or the storm surge, the sea level rise, and all these other elements that are impacting us as coastal property owners. When we fit all of these in somehow through the design process, we can see a significant success at maintaining the health of these landscapes. Okay, we'll hit the next one. Oh, and that's the last of it. So that's the end of our presentation for now. We invite you to send in some questions and contact us at the coordinates below there so that we can continue our conversation with you. Thank you.
All right, thanks for hanging in there, everyone. A couple of hiccups with our sound, and we continue to learn technologies, just such fun, but I'm really glad we were able to show the presentation. I'm starting to see some questions coming in, and so I'm going to start asking Rosemary some questions. I have a couple of my own too, but please feel free to keep sending your questions in. Well, Rosemary, let's see here. I had one individual ask, is there a go-to guide available for recommended plants for living shorelines in Atlantic provinces? Now, on that question, I've posted the little link from the EAC's website, the information you shared with us some time ago of coastal and native plants, but I'm wondering, are there any other suggestions that you would have where people could learn more about native plants in our area?
Sure. Well, I think a good first step is to really take a nice inventory of what's already growing in the landscape. So if you're noticing that bayberry is the dominant species in the shrub layer, then more of that would be great, obviously, right? If it's holding on and doing good work already, then mimicking more of the same. So we generally have things like Rosa virginiana, bayberry, sheep laurel, let's see, small trees in sumac, alder, fir, and spruce. And then the perennials being the grasses, of course, spartina, marram grasses, carex, rush, and then any of the asters, the goldenrods, etc. Yeah, I think the most important thing is to pay attention in real detail of what's happening within the upland and on the slope in your area, and then try to mimic those same plants as much as possible.
Wonderful. We've had a couple of people ask if we're going to share the presentation. So Rosemary, we'll make sure and ask you for a PDF and share that along with the video and your contact information.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
I have one person who said at St. Margaret's Bay in Nova Scotia, roses above the beach and shoreline have died in the last few years, starting with a storm that brought in warm, dry air with a lot of salt. Many apple trees and raspberries also died. Do you still recommend planting roses in the Bay area?
In general, the Rosa virginiana seems to be doing quite well. I know that we did have some really specific storms where it defoliated or desiccated the plants, many of which have rebounded on the projects that we have in the St. Margaret's Bay area. Bayberry would probably be my second favorite in that coastal zone. But again, just keeping your eye onto what is working in the neighborhood, whether it's at the local beach or in the local forest system, and mimicking those same plants is usually your best bet. And then of course, being aware that site-specific storms are going to happen, and perhaps you need to feed a little bit more or provide some fall and winter protection for those plants so that they're not being inundated by that salty air or stormwater.
Great, thank you. Here's a good question. This was on my list because I get asked this a lot. I'm going to ask you a question and I might paraphrase it by asking a sort of a second part. So one of our associates has asked, is a bank ever too steep for such methods? And a question that I get often is, you know, are there sites where a living shorelines approach just can't work? Too open ocean, too high wind? So I'll turn that over to you with the bank too steep first.
Well, we've been experimenting on some really steep banks. In fact, our crew has been trained in fall arrest and with the rappelling skills to go down and be able to come back up those steep slopes. So although a 90-degree bank is probably too steep to make work, I think it also depends on how high the bank is, first of all, to determine whether it's a valid location to try a shoreline, a living shoreline. And is there a location that doesn't work? Sure, there's definitely going to be places where the sea is just too rough. I mean, if you think about Peggy's Cove, for instance, it's all rock there, and there's a reason for that, right? All of that sand and sediment has been washed away hundreds, potentially longer than that, years ago, with those aggressive waves and storm surges and such. So I think you really need to look at the science and the climate change data that is available. When we do our site reports, we definitely dive in as deep as we can about what has happened in the past on this coast and what is projected to happen going forward. So certainly not every shoreline can be a living shoreline. I think it's worthwhile trying to incorporate plants, even if it is a very rough and rugged location in which perhaps you're putting in a rock wall or some other kind of strategy. I think the plants do add a benefit even into those hardened structures by softening the top layer and providing that protective mechanism around freeze-thaw cycling as well. Because even though those boulders are large, they can still be moved by the powers of nature. So adding that sort of vegetated quilt over top of a rock wall is definitely a benefit. But yeah, I think that leaning on science and just the simple math about these shorelines that are very tall or, you know, at a really aggressive angle, then certainly we have to have some other options, or realize that perhaps there's nothing to be done and we just have to allow Mother Nature to be the designer here and get out of her way so that she can do the work that's needed. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. I did have someone ask, I don't want to put you on the spot in a spelling bee situation all of a sudden, but someone asked if we could have the exact type of rose spelled out that you've mentioned.
Okay, sure. So it's Virginiana. So Virginia, Virginiana.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm just going to type that in. Thank you. And then someone's asking, how much maintenance does a living shoreline typically need?
Living shorelines are probably opposite of what the rock walls would be. So when we put in a living shoreline at Helping Nature Heal, we usually organize a 3, 5, or 10-year program. The plants need to be nurtured and cared for in order to get to a reasonable age where they're really thriving and doing the work for us. In some cases, people think of a rock wall as sort of a one and done installation. You know, the contractor arrives, builds the rock wall, and then goes away. And we don't think much about maintenance on those rock walls, although they do need maintenance and they do need periodic fixing from large storm events. A living shoreline is just that. It's a living entity. And so it doesn't ever end, really. It is a lifelong living relationship that we have with a coast. And the whole goal from the Helping Nature Heal perspective is that the landowner falls in love with the coastline, more so than just on a visual or aesthetic appeal guide, but more deeply than that, more about a lifestyle and a life choice of living on a dynamic system that is constantly changing, right? It's not like an urban landscape where you buy, you know, 100 by 100 foot lot and it stays that way until the day you sell it. In a coastal zone that's dynamic, that word just in itself infers that it is changing consistently and sometimes episodically in large ways. And so, you know, you can't wrap it around, you can't put boundaries around a dynamic system, right? Those are opposite things. So we would say that a shoreline takes an installation, a time for installation. Then generally we feed the plants 2 weeks after, and then usually a month after that. We also plant in 3 generations, meaning seeds, immature perennials or immature stock, and then mature plants, so that those mature plants are sending out seed right away. The next year, the immature plants will grow to that place, and then the 3rd year, the seedlings will come in and start sending off seed. And so things will die and we'll have storm issues within that 1st year, probably. Certainly within 2 or 3 years, there will be episodic change where, you know, a storm will come in and blow something apart. And we have to go back in and fix it and rebuild it. The whole point of a living shoreline is that over time, it gets stronger and those plants can do more work for us and we can do less work. And so at the beginning, there's definitely sort of a nurturing and care stage that is really required to make sure the plants have everything that they need in order to thrive. And typically after the 1st season, the critters move back in after, you know, construction has settled down and we're less on site. Once the critters move in and we get that poop loop generating food, then we don't have to be there to feed as frequently, but we do need to be able to come in and do what we call plant first aid. If there's a storm and something gets torn out, then we want to be back in there right away quickly to repair that wound. And just thinking of it as a wound on the land, you know, if you cut your arm or twist your ankle, it takes time for that to heal up. It takes a bit of our care and protection, like Band-Aids and medicines. It takes time to heal these wounds that have been created by us using and living the shoreline in such aggressive ways as, you know, putting a house or developing on top of it. So it is definitely something that needs to be put into your maintenance plan, just like you would maintain the painting on the side of your house or putting a new roof on every 10 years or so. It needs to be put into perspective like that, that if you're going to be living on a coastal property, that you will have to be in tune with it and connected to it in a deep enough manner that you understand what's going to happen when the storm rolls in on the weekend, and you do some preventative action and you pay attention to the storm and you monitor it. And then after the storm, you go out and you assess and you do any repairs that may need to be happening. What we have found is that repairing a living shoreline is much easier and less costly than it would be if you had to bring in an excavator and new boulders or perhaps a barge or something to repair a rock wall from the water's edge. Which we find in a lot of coastal properties, there's no room for gear to get back down once the house has been built, right? The shoreline is not accessible anymore to machinery. So that, you know, that in itself is definitely a bonus for when you're working with humans that can navigate and get around in small and tight places.
Yeah, that's really important. Unfortunately, this spring we're dealing with a whole lot of people taking big machinery into places they shouldn't be taking them and putting rock where they shouldn't and so on. So that's great to hear. I have, I think, 3 more questions. Let me see. From your experience, what are some of the trials and errors and types of plants and planting methods that haven't worked well for specific coastlines, such as the Bay of Fundy, South Shore, Northumberland Strait, whether they're sandy, rocky, or marshy? You had any catastrophic fail learning experiences?
For sure. I think anything that is new and requiring a lot of intuition and you know, looking at science and then trying to, you know, cook it up in a pot in different ideas of how we're going to take the science, take the information that we learn about these locations, and then try to develop some sort of process to, you know, slowing down the movement of sediment or slowing down water running off. We definitely have tried logs at the toe of the slope in some short embankments. And with the next storm surge, didn't the logs all float away? Of course, wood floats. And so making sure that we anchor those logs in a more strategic way was something that we've learned for sure. We also found in a very sandy location that we, you know, planted grass in, and then in the winter storms, the sand was, you know, taken away, as it often is, to a dune off the coast, and then brought back in the spring. Well, when it took all the sand out, it certainly took out our grasses and plants as well at the toe of that slope. And so, you know, when the sand came back, it didn't bring the grasses with it. they went on a little journey down the coastline somewhere. I think knowing the topography and how deep that sediment is, that sandbank or the clays or whatnot, before you hit bedrock is really important. Because if there's just a marginal amount of sand floating on top of that bedrock shelf, when the winter storms come in and pull the sand out, off it goes, right? And you're just left with that bedrock shelf again. And of course, nothing's latching onto that bedrock shelf. So yeah, we've certainly planted things that got washed out, and then, you know, then the sand reappears in the spring and you plant again and, you know, try to slow that cycle down. But the winter storms wreak a lot of havoc on these coastlines.
Thank you. Here's the question that I'm sure you were expecting. Let me just bring it up here, about costs for a living shoreline. Oops, I just jumped down here, just one sec here. Would it be possible to share information on the costs of living shoreline restoration? So complex question there, but is there anything you could say to comment on costs at this point?
Sure. It really is a site-specific mathematical equation. We want to know how long the coastline is, how wide your frontage is, and how high the coastline is, or the slope. So the length and the height of the slope is often the most important. We want to try to get plants growing